Most people think the United States canceled its hypersonic missile program. They were right. In March 2023, the Air Force officially walked away from the AGM-183A air-launched rapid response weapon after a string of failed tests, redirected funding, and a public declaration by the Secretary of the Air Force that the program was, in his words, done. Budget documents for fiscal year 2025 listed it under completed programs. No procurement, no research, no future. The obituary was written, the contractors were told to wind down, and the defense industry moved on to the replacement. Then in June 2025, the Air Force requested $387.1 million to begin full production. Not research, not prototyping, production. The missile that was canceled is coming back. And it is not coming back as the prototype that stumbled through a contested test campaign. It is coming back as the weapon adversaries were never supposed to face, hardened by failure, refined in classified testing, and funded with the urgency that only a closing threat gap can produce. The story of the ARRW is not a story about a program that almost worked. It is a story about what happens when the most powerful military on Earth watches its rivals field operational hypersonic weapons, realizes the margin is closing faster than the budget cycle can respond, and decides that a difficult missile in production is better than a perfect missile still on a drawing board. China's DF-17 hypersonic glide vehicle has been operationally deployed since 2019. Russia fired hypersonic weapons in actual combat over Ukraine, and the United States, the nation that invented stealth aircraft, precision-guided munitions, and networked warfare doctrine, was sitting on a canceled program and hoping its replacements would arrive in time. They decided the replacements could not wait. So, the program everyone buried came back from the dead, and it came back deadlier than anything adversaries planned to face. To understand what the ARRW actually is, you need to understand what it is trying to do, because the physics behind it are more strategically disruptive than any individual specification. The AGM-183A is a boost-glide hypersonic weapon. A solid rocket motor booster launches it from a B-52H Stratofortress at high altitude, accelerating it to speeds exceeding Mach 5, at which point the booster separates and the glide vehicle, an unpowered wedge of precision-engineered aerodynamics, continues independently, skipping along the upper edge of the atmosphere toward its target at speeds the program's own specifications placed as high as Mach 20. That is 15,000 miles per hour. At that speed, it covers a mile in roughly a fifth of a second. A conventional interceptor missile trying to engage it in terminal phase has less reaction time than a human eye can process. The weapon's operational range is approximately 925 kilometers, roughly 575 miles, though classified testing may have modified the production envelope in ways that have not been publicly disclosed. A B-52H can carry two of them on external pylons. A B-1B Lancer, under Air Force planning documents from 2020, could carry up to 31 of the combined weapons between the Common Strategic Rotary Launcher and external hardpoints. That number is not a misprint. 31 hypersonic weapons on a single bomber. Think about what that means for an adversary that has spent years and billions constructing integrated air defense networks around the assumption that one strategic bomber equals 1 to 2 strike packages with known flight profiles and predictable re-entry trajectories. The geometry of every defensive planning problem the adversary has just collapsed. And the physics are the reason that existing air defense architectures cannot simply adapt to stop it. A ballistic missile follows a predictable arc through space. Radar networks calculate its trajectory within seconds of launch. Interceptors are vectored to the mid-course engagement zone, and the problem becomes one of execution rather than geometry. A hypersonic glide vehicle does not follow that arc. It maneuvers laterally and vertically. It changes altitude mid-flight. It skips through atmospheric layers that existing interceptors were not engineered to operate in, too low for exo-atmospheric kill vehicles like the SM-3, too fast and too agile for terminal phase systems designed against subsonic and supersonic threats. The DFZF, China's operational glide vehicle launched aboard the DF-17 medium-range ballistic missile, exploits precisely this gap in the defense architecture. It re-enters the atmosphere at Mach 10 and approaches its target in a flat glide trajectory that dramatically shortens detection windows and compresses the time available for any intercept attempt. American defense planners watching China parade these weapons through Beijing's Tiananmen Square in October 2019 were not worried about a single missile. They were worried about what it meant for every forward base, every carrier strike group, and every coalition partner operating within the weapon's 1,800 to 2,500 kilometer range across the Pacific. The ARRW was built to be the answer. Then it failed repeatedly and expensively and publicly, and adversaries watching from intelligence networks drew exactly the conclusions the Air Force had hoped they would not. The testing record is the part of this story that most coverage gets wrong, because the failure rate is presented as evidence of a program that was fundamentally broken when delivered. It was not broken. It was difficult. Those are not the same thing. The ARRW completed its first successful flight test in May 2022 when a B-52H dropped the weapon off the coast of Southern California and the booster ignited, burned for its full expected duration, and the glide vehicle achieved speeds greater than Mach 5. A second successful boost test followed in July 2022 with primary and secondary objectives confirmed. The first complete end-to-end, all-up-round test, both booster and glide vehicle performing in live sequence against a real target, ran in December 2022 from Edwards Air Force Base. It was deemed a success, though sensors on the test range malfunctioned before the terminal phase, preventing full characterization of the warhead's lethality against the target. 3 more all-up-round tests followed through 2023. One failed when the aeroshell shroud protecting the glide vehicle failed to separate during ascent, invalidating the terminal flight data and ending the test before the weapon could engage. Another achieved nominal glide vehicle release, proper boost, ascent, and what the Air Force described as nominal warhead detonation. A third test produced what program statements called valuable new insights, which in procurement language is the precise formulation used when results were real but incomplete. The program's independent testing office concluded that preliminary indications showed ARRW could become an operationally lethal weapon, while noting that limited test data left lethality against the full target set unconfirmed. The final planned test launched from Andersen Air Force Base in Guam in March 2024. The Air Force said only that it had gained valuable insights. What the test actually produced in terms of terminal performance remains classified. That deliberate opacity is itself a signal. When the program is dead, you say so clearly. When something happened that you do not want your adversaries to fully understand, you say nothing useful. And the program that was officially listed as completed in budget documents in 2024 suddenly reappeared in Lockheed Martin production timelines and congressional testimony in 2025, with the company having declared readiness for low-rate manufacture as early as November 2023. The Air Force was not surprised by that readiness. They had been funding the analysis of test data from every flight, including the ones they refused to characterize publicly. Over $1.3 billion in cumulative contract value had been obligated to Lockheed Martin by the time the FY 2025 budget struck the program from procurement. What the Air Force actually did was stop paying for new tests and start paying for analysis, classification review, and production readiness documentation, the exact sequence of activities that precede a decision to move from prototyping to acquisition. The fiscal year 2025 budget killing the program was not a verdict on the technology. It was a budget mechanism, a way to pause without permanently closing the door while classified work continued and adversary threat assessments were updated. Then the threat assessments came back with numbers that made the pause untenable. What changed is not complicated once you understand the pressure that had been building since 2018. In that year, a United States official assessed that China had conducted approximately 20 times more hypersonic weapons tests than the United States had conducted in the preceding decade. 20 times. That asymmetry was not an accident of industrial capacity or geographic testing range availability. It was a deliberate, strategic decision by Beijing to establish dominance in the one domain where American technological advantage was thinnest and American defensive architecture was most exposed. The DF-17 reached operational status by October 2019, when it made its first official public appearance in a Beijing military parade. Military experts analyzing its probable employment scenarios in December 2025 concluded that in any Taiwan contingency, the weapon would almost certainly be used against United States military installations in Okinawa, degrading air and missile defense coverage in the opening minutes to clear the path for less survivable weapons to follow. Russia had demonstrated the Kinzhal air-launched hypersonic missile in active combat operations over Ukraine, had integrated the Zircon hypersonic cruise missile onto frigates and submarines, and was testing the Oreshnik system capable of Mach 10 to 11 with multiple independently targetable warheads intended for European deployment. The United States, across the same period, had a canceled Boost Glide program, a replacement scramjet weapon not expected to enter service before 2027 at the earliest, and an Army hypersonic system that had missed its own fielding milestones. Air Force Chief of Staff General David Alvin told the House Armed Services Committee in June 2025 that the service was moving both ARRW and the hypersonic attack cruise missile beyond research and development and into the procurement range in the very near future. He described ARRW specifically as a larger strategic long-range system already tested multiple times. Air Force Secretary Troy Mike told the same committee that the priority now was affordability, getting costs down to produce enough weapons to actually matter, not building 10 at stratospheric unit prices that a defense budget cannot sustain. The fiscal year 2026 budget documents confirmed $387.1 million for ARRW procurement and $802.8 million for HACM development. The Department of Defense overall requested more than $3.9 billion across all services for hypersonic programs in that single budget cycle. That is not a line item. That is a strategic declaration that the United States intends to field operational hypersonic strike capability before the threat assessment hardens further. The Congressional Budget Office had previously estimated that a 300-unit ARRW production run would cost approximately $5.3 billion. At that scale, the weapon enters the Air Force inventory in numbers sufficient to matter operationally, carried by bombers already forward deployed at Andersen and Guam, at Diego Garcia, and at bases positioned to reach Pacific and European theater targets within the weapon's range envelope. China and Russia have been planning their air defense architectures around the assumption that the United States would not have operational hypersonic strike weapons for years. That planning assumption is now wrong. An adversary that built its integrated air defense network around tracking and intercepting ballistic missiles and conventional cruise missiles is now facing a weapon that does not fly like either. A weapon that skips through the detection gap between exo-atmospheric interceptors and terminal phase defenses, that arrives with kinetic energy sufficient to destroy hardened targets without a conventional explosive warhead, and that can be carried in quantity on aircraft already in operational service. The missile that was publicly declared dead in March 2023 spent the next 2 years being quietly perfected in classified testing, analyzed by engineers with access to every test flight's telemetry, and positioned for a procurement request the moment the threat environment made continuation of the pause indefensible. Most people think the United States canceled its hypersonic missile program. They were right, for exactly long enough to learn everything the failed tests had to teach. The missile that comes back from that cancellation is not the prototype that stumbled. It is the weapon that absorbed every failure, every malfunctioning shroud, every test range sensor anomaly, and every congressional funding cut, and emerged ready for production as America's first operational air-launched hypersonic strike weapon. That is not a revival. That is what winning the development phase actually looks like when the stakes are high enough to survive it.